This just in from our friends at the League of Restorative Justice. Following many months of dedicated research into Michael DeCorta's criminal indictment for fraud in December 2019, pertinent law, and all the transcripts from his trial in April 2022, it has been discovered that Mr. DeCorta was unlawfully convicted for a fraud he did not commit. With a video following this newsflash, the League begins to illustrate findings that prove Michael DeCorta did not defraud Oasis lenders as alleged. Stay tuned to this channel for updates, exclusive reports, revelations, and future exposés about the case from the League of Restorative Justice.
Before Michael DeCorta stepped into the courtroom to defend himself, prosecutors had already given the grand jury information about him. The grand jury's job was to decide whether to send Michael DeCorta to trial for fraud. This didn't mean he was guilty of fraud. It simply meant Michael looked guilty enough to be tried. At trial, however, the burden of proof is very high. The prosecution had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that DeCorta committed fraud on a victim. To convict Michael of fraud, they had to prove to each juror that all 6 things required to prove a fraud were actually performed between DeCorta and his alleged victims. The law calls those 6 things elements. Now, what are these 6 elements? First, he must have made a false statement about something important, a material fact. Second, he must have known it was false at the time he stated it. Third, he must have made the statement with the intent to deceive or mislead someone. Fourth, the victim must have relied on that false statement and acted on it. Fifth, the victim must have suffered actual harm or loss as a result. And finally, there must be a direct link between the false statement and the harm suffered. Here's the key. All 6 of these elements must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt for a jury to rightfully return a guilty verdict. If even one of these elements is missing, if the statement wasn't knowingly false, if the victim didn't rely on it, or if no harm occurred, then the charge of fraud cannot stand, and a jury should return a not guilty verdict. This high standard of proof is essential to protect individuals from wrongful conviction and to ensure that only those who are truly guilty are held accountable. In DeCorta's case, the jury had to carefully examine the evidence for each of these 6 elements before reaching their decision. In the end, since they returned a verdict of guilty, our questions are, did the jurors have all the facts concerning Michael's activities? Were those facts truthfully and clearly explained? Or were some left out of the trial, conflated with something else, or presented to the jury in such a way as to mislead or confuse them about the truth? Or did the prosecution introduce something into evidence that was not present in the grand jury's indictment that misled the jury to convict him for the wrong reason?
Michael DeCorta was criminally accused of fraud. In a criminal trial for fraud, the law requires the prosecution prove beyond a reasonable doubt that every single one of 6 crucial acts called elements took place. Think of these elements as ingredients for baking a cake. Imagine you're baking a cake. You need flour, sugar, eggs, milk, chocolate, and baking powder. Every baker knows that if even one ingredient is missing, your cake won't turn out right. It won't rise, won't taste right, or simply won't bake properly. With all ingredients, you get a perfect cake. But missing just one ingredient, say baking powder, turns your cake into a mess like this. Similarly, in a fraud case, all 6 factual elements must be proven for the jury to return a guilty verdict. These elements are: 1. The defendant made a false statement. 2. That false statement concerned a critical fact related to the plaintiff's damages. 3. The defendant knew the statement was false. 4. The defendant intended the plaintiff to rely on that false statement. 5. The plaintiff reasonably relied on the false statement. 6. The plaintiff suffered damages because of this reliance. Once the jurors are chosen, a lawyer from each side will face the jury and make an opening statement that describes their theory of the case and why they think it's the correct point of view. Imagine that the defense counsel explains to the jury what you just learned about the 6 essential elements needed to prove the defendant guilty of fraud and leaves them displayed on a whiteboard for reference. After the opening statements are done, the prosecution will invite a witness to take the stand and begin trying to prove their case by asking them some questions. This is called examining the witness. After the prosecution is done, the defense gets a chance to cross-examine the witness with other questions. Finally, If the prosecution wants to emphasize or clarify a certain point, they can ask a few follow-up questions in what's called a recross. During Mike's trial, the prosecutor aimed for each witness to give testimony proving at least one element of fraud, similar to confirming that a baker received at least one of the 6 ingredients needed to make a chocolate cake. In cross-examination, the defense intended to make it clear if the witness didn't prove anything, or at least wanted to give the jury reasonable doubt that they had. Each juror should note witnesses' names and mark which element, if any, their testimony supports. Keep in mind that a witness's testimony may fail to establish anything beyond a reasonable doubt, so don't be concerned if you find their statements unconvincing or irrelevant. After all witnesses testify, the jurors retire to another room and deliberate together. If they had each taken notes, they can simply compare them with one another. If some jurors have an element checked off and others don't, then they will need to discuss their differences until everyone is convinced of one side or the other. If even one element remains unchecked, it's like trying to drive a car that loses a wheel, or sailing a boat after it loses its sail. Just like that cake missing an ingredient won't rise, a fraud case missing even one proven element can't lead to a guilty verdict. If all 12 jurors agree that even one element wasn't proven, they must return a verdict of not guilty. If there's disagreement over whether an element was proven or not, they must debate until a unanimous agreement is reached. If they cannot reach one, they must report the deadlock to the judge. The judge would ask for confirmation that they couldn't reach a unanimous agreement and then declare a hung jury. That would end the trial, but leave the case open for the prosecution try again with a different jury if they choose to do so. Because justice, like baking, demands that all the ingredients are present and proven, without exception.
To wrap up, let's quickly summarize the key points Portia covered. Before Michael DeCorta's trial began, a prosecutor convinced a grand jury that he should go to trial. At trial, the prosecution had to meet the highest standard, which was to prove each of the 6 elements of fraud beyond a reasonable doubt. These 6 elements are: first, there must have been a false statement about something important. Second, DeCorta must have known the statement was false. Third, he must have intended to deceive his alleged victim. Fourth, that victim must have relied on DeCorta's false statement. Fifth, the victim must have suffered actual harm or loss. And finally, there must be a direct link between the false statement and the harm. The prosecution had to prove each of the 6 elements beyond a reasonable doubt. If even one was not proven, the jury could not rightfully return a guilty verdict. This high standard ensures fairness and protects against wrongful convictions, holding only those truly guilty accountable. Since Michael was convicted, we are left with several important questions about what happened at the trial, the exploration of which is the purpose for these videos. Thank you for your attention.
Michael DeCorta did not defraud the Oasis lenders. Watch as we prove it in the videos that follow.
This production was made possible by the generous support of attorney Brent Allen Winters, whose commitment to his Oasis clients and the Trust LLT has been invaluable. We extend our deepest appreciation to him and his wife Susan for their unwavering encouragement and support throughout the development of this project. Before its public release, this video was carefully curated by the League of Restorative Justice for the edifying benefit of Oasis lenders and the general public. All video clips and still images featured in this production are either proprietary and protected by copyright or consist of royalty-free stock materials provided by various companies whose tools we utilized in creating this video. The design, production, and distribution of this video were accomplished using a Macintosh Pro, operating on Apple's Mac OS Sonoma system 14.7.1. In recognition of the essential tools that facilitated the production of this work, we would like to acknowledge the following companies and the software they provided. All materials used in the design and production of this video were created using licensed software.